All right, guys, this is not the prettiest PowerPoint or presentation video or whatever you want to call it in the world, but it is going to get the job done. We need to talk about World War One because it really brings us into an understanding of what happens in the 1930s in Germany and the build-up to World War II and ultimately the Holocaust. And that is the case study that we're going to use to provide a historical framework for our conversation about human behavior. So I want to go through a quick overview of World War One, but to reassure everyone that although I'm a history teacher, I'm not going to turn this into a straight up history class. Want us to stay focused on motivations and human behavior and how human beings impact the course of history, right? We are not powerless to stop anything. We are always in complete control of our actions, right? Or are we, right? Because we are going to talk about something called choiceless choices a bit later on. But World War One, we need it. We need to provide a framework. I also want to mention that there are some in the scholarly community, history nerds like me and maybe you, who believe or who feel that World War One and World War Two should actually be considered one giant war because there's just a short little break in between, but one giant war and call it the Great War. I personally don't necessarily agree with that, but I am curious to know what you guys think. So make sure that you can articulate the causes of World War One, that you know who the big players were, who was involved, and what makes the war so deadly. And then all of that is going to spill over into the Weimar Republic and what happens in the aftermath of World War One in Germany and the build up to World War Two. So this is just a map to remind you of the alliances in 1914. Very commonly, when I teach history, I will ask, what are the causes of World War One? Who was involved in World War One? Most people can get the who was involved because it's fairly similar to who was involved in World War Two. But when I ask for the causes of World War One, most people jump in with a resounding, Hitler, the Nazis, the Holocaust, World War One. That's not World War One. We tend to think of World War One as Germany being evil because they are on the other side of the United States, right? And also because we know, with the perspective of history, what happens in World War II. That is not the case in World War One. And yes, there is side A and side B, right? There is an us versus them in World War One because we ultimately joined the war on the side of the folks in blue there, the Triple Entente. But just be aware that it's not this big ugly villain that we see Germany as in World War One. That's really not a reality until World War Two. Also notice Austria-Hungary there on the map. And just to the south of Austria-Hungary, you have Serbia, which is going to be ground zero, so to speak, for the beginning of the war. So what causes it? I want you to think about an acronym called MANIA, right? MANIA. Militarism is the M, a build up of the military in Europe. And as people sort of race to amass more and more weapons, you'll get the feeling that some sort of conflict is going to be inevitable. Now, again, we don't think anything is inevitable in history, but it certainly seems likely that something is going to happen based on the stockpile of weapons that European countries are having. You're more likely to use weapons when you have a lot of those weapons, so it seems. So militarism is one cause. Alliances are another cause. If we go back here, alliances make it much less likely that you will have a small confined conflict, right? That Austria-Hungary is going to go to war with Serbia, for example, or even that Russia is going to go to war with Austria-Hungary. Because of the alliance system, different countries are going to get drawn in a way that they may not have previously or otherwise. Nationalism, this sort of extreme pride of country. And there is a bit of a distinction between nationalism and patriotism. I consider myself to be a patriotic person when it comes to the United States of America. Different people may have different feelings on it, but I tend to view myself as someone who is patriotic. But nationalism is not the same thing. Nationalism is my country at the expense of other countries, my people at the expense of other people. The best, the greatest, the only one that can be good, if that makes sense. So if you are France and you are nationalistic, then everything that you do is sort of subjugating another country to climb on top. Think about the early days of colonization, this sort of scramble for territory to build up and build up and build up. And that is the I. That's imperialism. Countries are fanning out. And so you really, World War I is a world war because all of these countries that are controlled by European nations become involved as a result. So you don't just have a European conflict. You have a conflict that spans the world. And assassination. And that is this guy right here. This is Gavrilo Princip. Gavrilo Princip is the assassin that is responsible for the murder of a man named Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie. It happens on June 28th, 1914. He will be captured and he will end up spending the rest of his years in a work camp, a forced labor camp that you might call a concentration camp, because yes, those existed prior to the Holocaust. I want to tell you a little bit about the group he belonged to, what he stood for, maybe what their motivations were. So Gavrilo Princip is part of a group called the Black Hand. They are a terrorist organization. Actually, I'm going to see if I have a map. I can't remember. No, I don't. So I'm going to go back here. They are a terrorist organization, and they are... or they're considered to be a terrorist organization, right? And they are based in Serbia, and they are against Austria-Hungary. See how giant Austria-Hungary is right there, 1914? It used to be larger. And so small ethnic minority groups in the Balkans are breaking away and creating their own independent nation. Austria-Hungary is dying. There's an expression that some empires are like sharks, because if a shark doesn't move, it dies, right? That's how it breathes. If an empire isn't growing and expanding, it's dying because it becomes so big that it can't control all of its territory sort of at the edges. And that southern edge of Austria-Hungary is very vulnerable. And there is a location in the southern western portion of Austria-Hungary called Croatia. Bosnia and Croatia. And that is where Franz Ferdinand, who is the Archduke and heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, for some reason decides it would be a good idea to go there and show his face. Now, their thinking is, the royal family's thinking is that there are people there who are agitating for independence, who are agitating for freedom. We need to make a show that we're still in charge here. We are your leaders. And they want to have this big parade through the streets. The problem is that the Black Hand is a terrorist group. They operate out of Serbia, which is right there. And they would like to disrupt this sort of show of patriotism towards Austria-Hungary and nationalism in Austria-Hungary. And so they plan to assassinate Franz Ferdinand. And in the process, they do end up also killing his wife. Now, it was all about to not happen because the Austria-Hungarian officials actually discover this plot prior to the assassination. And so they reroute the parade. There was going to be an explosion. He was going to be killed. They reroute the parade. They discover the devices, etc. It just so happened to be that the new parade route took them right past this man, Gavrilo Princip, a member of that group, who happened to have a gun with him. And when he saw them, he took a chance and he killed both of them. Very sad. And very fateful, I guess you could say. I mean, the Balkans, that little portion down here in the bottom right, the southeast portion of this map, are considered to be, during World War I, this powder keg, the powder keg of Europe. They are the spark that is igniting this war that's really going to be started with mania. And so there is a conversation to be had about what starts World War I. Is it just this assassination, or is it the rest of those letters too? And it's really all of them. So the immediate cause is the assassination. The sort of longer, more built up causes are the M, A, N, and I part of that mania term. So the major players involved are going to be Serbia, Russia, France, Italy, Japan, Britain, and the United States, because remember, this is a world war. Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. And if you look at the Central Powers, there are two nations on there that after World War I ceased to exist, Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. You could argue that Russia changes, but Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire cease to exist. Because they are going to be divided up when the war is over. Essentially what happens is that, let me go back to this map. Austria-Hungary believes strongly that Serbia is funding terrorist groups. This always reminds me a little bit of the United States and Iraq, claiming that, Iraq is harboring, or even Afghanistan, that those countries were harboring the Taliban. And I'm not making a judgment about whether or not that was true. I mean, that's believed to be accurate, right? I'm not saying that it's not true, but it's certainly questionable in World War I. But Austria-Hungary says, hey, Serbia, you did this. You harbored this terrorist organization, the Black Hand, and we want to punish you. So Austria-Hungary sends this list of really impossible demands to Serbia. Serbia is this small, sort of newly independent nation, and everyone in Serbian government hates Austria-Hungary, right? Because they are a newly independent nation. And Austria-Hungary says, please turn over to us anyone in your government that has ever spoken negatively against us. We would like to try them and anyone else associated with this group in our own country. Serbia says, no, we can't do that. We can't do that because we are a sovereign nation. A sovereign nation is a nation that governs itself, that makes its own decisions about its own leadership, and who it will and will not punish. And so, Serbia is going to essentially not be able to acquiesce to the demands of the letter. Before Austria-Hungary sends this letter, it looks around at this alliance situation, and it knows that it's going to be in big trouble. Russia is chomping at the bit to get access to I just paused this video because I got a phone call and it looked important, and it was about an auto warranty sale. These people will not stop. So as I was saying, Austria-Hungary looks around at this alliance situation that it finds itself in, and it sees Russia. Russia's right there chomping at the bit. There's a concern that Russia has been funding Serbia also because they want to disrupt Austria-Hungary so that they can take its territory, right? And so what it does before it sends that letter with that list of demands to Germany, or to Serbia, is it asks its most powerful ally, which is Germany, hey, if we send this letter to Serbia, will you have our back? And Germany says, yeah, we'll have your back. We'll back you up. So Austria-Hungary is aware that it's probably about to touch something off that is significant. So let me go back here. There are over 20 million deaths. If you look at the breakdown here, Germany is extremely, I don't know if I want to say disproportionately, but I'm just going to say it, disproportionately affected. There are 2 million Germans that die in World War I. And I want us to think about what that means for the German population after the war, right? Look at Russia, 1.7 million. Even though they leave the war early in 1917, and they are so poorly funded and prepared to fight a war. They don't feed, the government doesn't feed its soldiers as they march them. They're like, bring your own uniform, bring your own weapon. And if you don't have a weapon, you have to wait for the person in front of you to get killed. And then you can hopefully take their weapon. It's insanity. It prompts a revolution in the middle of the war, and they leave in 1917. Austria-Hungary loses 1.1 million people and also ceases to exist after the war. And of course, the United States comes in towards the end of World War I, provides some fresh legs, and ends up losing 116,000. So in total, there are millions of deaths, a whole lot of despair and suffering. And it is called often the Great War because the idea is that is the war to end all wars, which of course we know isn't true. We will be talking more about the Treaty of Versailles, but know this: the Allies win the war, but they fail to secure the peace. So I'm going to say that again. The Allies win the war, but fail to secure the peace. The issues around the ending of World War I will haunt Europe and be one of the leading causes of World War II. So if people ask you what caused World War II, you say World War I. World War I caused World War II. And of course, it's much more nuanced than that, but you would have a solid argument. The Treaty of Versailles is the treaty that ends World War I at the 11th hour of the 11th day and the 11th month of 1918. That's when the peace is. That's when the armistice is. The treaty is going to be signed in 1919. So, to be continued with our conversation about Versailles. Thank you for paying attention, and let me know if you have any questions at all.